I'm here and surrounded by dissertations written by students in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations, going back to the 1930s. With Professor Tian Xiaofei, you've joined this department and your work is in medieval literature, this period after the Han Empire collapses into the reunification in Sui Tang. I've been reading some of your work. One of the things that I've been really fascinated by is this sense that you have that this sort of statecraft reading of the medieval period, which says, you know, they didn't reunify China, right? These guys, they were wimps. They didn't think right. They didn't have the right values. They didn't reunify. That if I read your work, what I see is that sort of view misses the richness of the medieval period. When you look at the medieval period, what do you see and what do you find interesting?
This sort of negative appraisal of statecraft, usually focuses on the Southern dynasties, the Southerners. The Southerners are usually considered the wimps, right? I think this actually obscures, first of all, this representational nature of history. I think there's always a gap between representation and what it purports to exemplify. So if we buy into this view of the Southern dynasties being miserable political failures and so on and so forth, we tend to forget the fact that this kind of appraisal comes from the conquest dynasties. First of all, the winners, exactly. More importantly, I suppose, for me as a literary scholar, this in many ways kind of leaves another curious gap, a gap between the literary historical appraisal and representation of the Southern dynasty, Southern literature, and the actual influence the Southern literature wielded in subsequent development of Chinese literature. That is, in literary histories, usually, in pre-modern China, we have this kind of appraisal all appear in state-sponsored dynastic histories. That is, they pass judgment on the literature, on the literary men of letters of the Southern dynasties. In state-sponsored dynastic histories, they would say they were miserable political failures, and also their failure in politics, in military culture, in many ways must be blamed on their moral inferiority. So political failure was tied to their perceived moral inferiority, which, in many ways, was perceived to be responsible for bad literature. So this is the official version. This is the version basically given in dynastic histories and on all the theoretical level, literary historical representation. On the other side, we have a curious fact that is the Southern dynasties literature wielded immense influence on the Northerners, on the conquest dynasties, and in the subsequent development of Chinese literature.
When I think about famous poets from the period, there's Tian or Tao Yuanming, people like this.
Absolutely.
They're all Southern.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. So Tao Yuanming, Xie Lingyun, the landscape poet, but also subsequently the court poets. Yes, and so the court poets, I suppose, they bore the kind of the brunt of this, the condemnation of the Southern dynasties. The Southern court.
So one of the things that you've written is that there's a tremendous fascination in the South with newness and innovation. This Chinese term xinqi. In later periods, this is often a condemnation of people, that they want to be new and different, and how could that ever be good? But there's this love of the new and different, it seems. Well, how come? Why does this happen? What's this?
This interest interest in newness and originality. One thing is the tremendous emphasis placed on literary excellence during this period in the South, in the Southern dynasties. And this, I feel, primarily was for two reasons. First reason is that we know that early medieval China was very much aristocratic culture. Everything was tied to bloodline, family lineage. You know, if you are a cousin of Lord so-and-so, then you get appointment in the court, get a high official position. But in the Southern dynasties, the Southern rulers try to change that. They realize, you know, this system was not really working all that well because, you know, the dim-witted cousin of Lord so-and-so should not be occupying this position. And so in many ways, Southern rulers, especially Emperor Wu of the Liang dynasty, tried to change this kind of political system, try to change the recruitment system by placing immense emphasis on literary excellence, literary learning, and so to counterbalance the aristocratic culture that placed too much emphasis on just the blood lineage and you know, family and the clan. Yeah.
So Emperor Wu is the founder of the Liang dynasty?
That's correct.
And that's in the 6th century, early 6th century.
That's right, first part of 6th century. Yes, yeah. So he tried to renovate the recruitment system, and also by basically conferring immense cultural prestige on people who are not necessarily from the top tier of the aristocracy, but who possessed, you know, literary talents.
And literary talent then gets measured by this originality and excellence of composition. One of the things that's been said about Emperor Wu of the Liang dynasty, the Liang dynasty lasts, what,
57 years. Yes.
Then it's supplanted by the Chun dynasty in the south, and then in 589, the Sui dynasty moves south and conquers the south.
Yes.
But I read once some text that the Liang dynasty fell because the emperor invested too much in Buddhism.
Yes.
So here is a man whose court sponsors the literary, the artistic, but at the same time, it seems that he's very interested in giving patronage to Buddhism as well.
Absolutely, yes.
How come? How do these
yes,
go together?
I feel that Buddhism and literature are the two scapegoats that people tend to use, and people have been using, you know, Buddhism and literature to blame on the fall of the Liang dynasty and the fall of the South. This obscures a lot of things. For one thing, you know, there's a lot of things that the Northern dynasties and Southern dynasties have in common, more so than people normally, you know, care to admit, or more than they themselves care to admit. For one thing, both sides, both North and South, were passionate about Confucian learning, Confucian classics. They did an immense amount of commentaries on both sides, but there, of course, the style of doing commentary might be very different, you know, vary from North to South. Another thing they were equally passionate about was Buddhism. So again, you can see the irony of this. That is, nobody, you know, because the Northern dynasties eventually turned out to be the conquest dynasty, so nobody ever even give any thought to, you know, the fact that the Northern rulers were equally devout.
Even more.
Very much so. If you look at all the beautiful statues, Buddhist statues at Luoyang, right? Yeah.
Right.